I'm grateful that Amity has given me this opportunity of interacting with all of you. And I have very pleasant memories of growing up in Bombay. I grew up and spent 12 years in Powai, not far from where your university is located. Now, the topic that I was asked to speak to you on, and which we are having this interaction, is on a personality who dominated Indian politics for almost 15 years, from 1947 to 1962. He was known to be the closest ideological comrade and soulmate of India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru. He was also the man who single-handedly kept the flag of Indian freedom flying in England from 1930 to 1947. And he made the environment in England ripe for Indian independence when the Britishers were not willing to grant us the independence. Here was a man who fought for Indian independence in England, didn't go to jail, wasn't lathi charged in India, didn't sit on hunger strike in India, but fought for Indian independence in the forums of the British media, British intellectual and political opinion, particularly the Labour Party. So he had a pre-independence career, which is very important. We all think that Indian freedom was earned by people agitating in India. That is, of course, the primary reason. But in addition, there was also this British dimension of our freedom movement. The Indian freedom movement was not a revolution in the strict sense of the term, like the Russian Revolution or the Chinese Revolution or the French Revolution. It was more a product of negotiations between the Indian leadership in the Congress Party, led by Mahatma Gandhi, of course, and the British Labour Party and British political and intellectual opinion. And in this process of negotiation, Krishna Menon played a crucial role as Nehru's point man in London. However, it is after independence that Krishna Menon's reputation really takes off, and he becomes the global envoy, the global ambassador to the United Nations in 1952, before which he was for 5 years India's first High Commissioner in England, in the UK. And as chairman of India's delegation to the United Nations, that is when he makes his name. In the 1950s, he used to be called Formula Menon, because wherever there was a problem, whether it was Vietnam, whether it was Cambodia, whether it was Laos, whether it was Korea, whether it was Algeria, Congo, wherever there was a problem, Krishna Menon, who was not liked because he was blunt and forthright, but he was respected for his intellect, was called upon to find a solution. And that is why he is called Formula Menon. Krishna Menon's importance in Indian politics comes from the fact that he is singularly held responsible for our defeat, our debacle, military debacle in October, November of 1962, when the Chinese invaded India in 2 phases. Krishna Menon is forced to resign as defense minister on the 7th of November, in between the 2 phases of the Chinese invasion. And thereafter, he really fades out of Indian politics. He remains a member of parliament. He represented Bombay for 2 terms in 1957 and 1962. But subsequently, he represents Midnapore in West Bengal. And finally, he represents Trivandrum, which is now represented in the Lok Sabha by Shashi Tharoor. So after 1962, really, his political career is eclipsed. And he is a member of parliament. He's an influential voice, but he doesn't count for much. So it is really in 1962, that his role has come under a microscope, and he's held to be the man responsible for creating the conditions which led to India's military debacle. And we can discuss this a little later. Um, the importance of Krishna Menon is he was a man of ideas. He was a man very conscious of India's role in the world community. He was a dark man, a black man, a third world man at a time when the white man ruled the world. Remember, we are talking of the 1940s and the 1950s, when the UK and the US were still predominant in international forums. And Krishna Menon really stood up for non-alignment. He invented the word non-alignment, stood up for India, stood up for the third world, stood up for South Africa, stood up for decolonization. Much of Africa had to be decolonized. And over a 13-year period from 1952, over a 10-year period, 52 to 62, he makes about 100 speeches in the United Nations in New York, each of which has become part of history. And of course, he holds the record for the longest speech ever made at the UN, where he spoke for almost over 8.5 hours in February of 1957 on the issue of Kashmir, which put India's case on Kashmir on a sounder legal and political footing than it had been so far. So mention Krishna Menon today and people say, oh, 1962. But, he is more than 1962. His life goes back to the 1920s, as I said. His Indian Independence League in London, his contributions to the solution of the crisis in Korea, his contribution to solving the Suez Canal crisis of 1956, and the sheer brilliance of the man, that he could win twice from Bombay without even campaigning in Bombay, without being able to speak a word of Marathi, without being able to speak a word of Hindi, speaks volumes of the man's personality and, of course, of his relationship, special relationship that he had with Jawaharlal Nehru. So to understand Indian politics, you have to understand Jawaharlal Nehru. And in my view, to understand Jawaharlal Nehru, in many ways, you have to understand the relationship, the special relationship that he enjoyed with Krishna Menon. Krishna Menon, of course, was very close to Indira Gandhi as well. So he was part of the extended Nehru household. And this biography that I have written, which came out a couple of months ago, and which some of you have been good enough to read, is basically not to glorify him or not to demonize him, but to use him and his own writings, his own letters, his own memos to tell a story. As I said, the job of a biographer is not to judge. The job of the biographer is to put the facts on the table in the public domain so that the reader can make up for himself or herself. So my intention is not to make him a hero or a villain, but my intention is to tell a political story for the period 1930 to the mid-60s, in which he plays a very important role. In India, we either make our leaders into heroes or zeros. We are experts in bhakti yoga. We are bhakts, or we demonize somebody. So I think, public life is much more complicated. Public life is not black and white. There are shades of gray. And my biographies have avoided the extremes of black and white, but have been in that middle ground of shades of gray, and to bring out the real personality through archival material, not through oral recollections, not through memories, which are notoriously unreliable, but on the written word. So all my biographies are based on files, notings, letters, memos, which are all available to anybody, either at the National Archives or at the Nehru Memorial Museum Library or other archives. Here was a fascinating man who, in many ways, was India's second best known personality in the world, the second most photographed personality in the world, the second most written about personality in the world, and certainly the most hated Indian personality in the world. In the late 40s and the 50s and the early 60s, everybody hated him, but people also loved him, but people could never ignore him. And I think that's a true measure of the impact that he had on not only Indian politics, but also world politics.
Jairam sir, after reading your book, A Checkered Brilliance, one comes to a logical conclusion that Mr. Krishna Menon is a very complex and a very difficult personality to understand. He's contradictory. At the same time, he's very clever. He's intense. At the same time, he's very intellectual. He's impetuous and insecure. At the same time, he's very, he plays favorites with the army personnel as well. So in some sense, he's a very paradoxical personality. Would you agree to that?
Absolutely. He was very paradoxical. He was a man of extremes. He delighted in giving offense where no offense needed to be given. So he was, he was a very he was a very complex man. But I'm not a psychologist, and I don't believe in the psychological explanations. There is a school of history which is called psychohistory, which looks at psychological explanations. Sexual frustration, the way he was brought up by children. These are some of the reasons that people look at for understanding the behavior of leaders. I don't go to that way. I stick to the narrative. I stick to the facts, and the facts are that he was very, very mercurial. He was capable of extraordinary brilliance, but he was also capable of extraordinary petulance. He could be petty, he could be mean, he could be vindictive, but he could be generous. He could be magnanimous as well. So he was a very complex and complicated man. I think that's what I've tried to bring out in the book, that don't judge people easily. Life is, people are bundles of contradictions. People in public life particularly contain multitudes amongst themselves. And he was one who contained multitudes within himself. There's no black or white.
I think sir, the 1962 has completely overshadowed the entire personality of Krishna Menon. I think the most interesting aspect of the book was the years prior to 1947. Here's a man who is discovered by Annie Besant, another personality who has unfortunately been reduced to a footnote in history. And she was the one who literally around her, she was the fulcrum around which the entire Indian independence movement was taking place. Whether it was Nehru, whether it was Gandhi, or for that matter, whether it was Krishna Menon. In fact, she had deeply influenced Krishna Menon to a lot of extent. Not just Krishna Menon in particular, you also talk about the great philosopher Krishnamurti, J.D. Krishnamurti, who they literally refer to her as their mother figure. So, can you enlighten a bit about that as well?
You see, the Gandhi becomes the supreme political leader in India only in December of 1920. This is at the Nagpur session of the Indian National Congress that Gandhi emerges as the supreme political and moral leader. In the late 19th century, it was Gopal Krishna Gokhale, who was considered to be India's preeminent political leader. In the early part of the 20th century, for a brief period of 2 years, it was Aurobindo who was considered to be, the great leader. Then for almost 10 years, it was Lokmanya Tilak, who was the preeminent leader in India. Tilak, of course, dies in 1920. Gokhale dies in 1915. And Aurobindo takes sannyas, in the in the 1912, 1913 period. Uh, so these were the four big leaders. There was Gokhale, there was Aurobindo for a brief while, there was Tilak for a long period, almost 10 years, uh, 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 and then Gandhi comes in 2020, in 1920. However, the one person whom I think who made educated upper class, and remember, most of these people were Brahmins. They were all upper caste. They were all well educated, English educated. And the one person who made them really proud of being Hindus, being proud of Indian culture, and wanting to get out of British rule was Annie Besant. Annie Besant comes to India sometime. She gets involved with the Theosophical Society, which was formed in 1875. The Theosophical Society was formed in New York. It moves its headquarters to Adyar in Madras in 1885. And by the mid 1890s, Annie Besant gets completely enchanted, engrossed, and embraced by India. So, she is in Bombay, there is an Annie Besant Road.
Right, right.
In Madras,
Yeah, right.
there is a Besant Nagar. There is a Theosophical Society, of course. But Annie Besant is, in my view, one of the great forgotten figures of the Indian freedom movement. She was very close to Madan Mohan Malviya. She played a very important role in education, in Sanskrit. She was one of the early in 1905, along with Bhagwan Das. She translated the Bhagavad Gita, which becomes a very important book for people of that generation. So she was an inspiring figure. And the reason why she was inspiring to all these upper caste, English educated Indians who were fighting for independence is because she kept telling them that your legacy is great, India is very great, India is, Indian culture is very great, and the British have nothing to offer to you, and you must get home rule. So Annie Besant was a very formative figure. The role of the Theosophical Society has not been fully studied by historians. I hope some Indian political scientist, looks at the role of the There are a couple of books, but nothing really substantive on how the Theosophical Society. By the way, we are still very active culturally in Madras, in Adyar, but they play a very important role. Alan Octavian Hume, who founded the Indian National Congress in 1885, was a Theosophist. Madan Mohan Malviya was a Theosophist. Jawaharlal Nehru was a Theosophist at the age of 13. Motilal Nehru was. Gandhi was very close to the Theosophists, not so much in India, but when he was in England in 1889, and the first time he reads the Bhagavad Gita was in the Theosophical Society. So you're right, Annie Besant is a very important figure. And she's more than roads, that in Worli, I think in Madras. And, in one place I got very angry because there is a sign which says Dr. A.B. Road. Now, who is Dr. A.B.? How will people know who A.B. is? A.B. could be Atmaram Borwankar, but it was actually Annie Besant. Well, Krishna Menon was the only man in the 1950s arguing for a negotiated settlement with China. And this is the other reason why he becomes very important in the current context as well. He was the only man, I would say, beginning 1955 onwards, consistently arguing that we must negotiate the border with China. The Chinese have claims, we have claims, and we should settle it through some mutual give and take. Now, unfortunately for him, after 1958, Nehru's political position within his own cabinet begins to get weak. Nehru's cabinet is divided vertically. On the one side, you have Govind Vallabh Pant and you have Morarji Desai arguing vehemently against any negotiated settlement. And on the other side, what is loosely called the left wing. You had Krishna Menon and then you had K.D. Malavia. But K.D. Malavia has to resign after a while. So the right wing after 1958, as I have documented in the book, becomes very important within Nehru's own cabinet. And after 1958, Nehru is in a period of long political decline. The Nehru of post-1958 is not the Nehru of the early 50s. He's in a state of, his health begins to weaken, his political position begins to weaken, his dependence on the West begins to increase because of the economic crisis. And don't forget Parliament. Parliament was completely against any negotiated settlement. All the speeches in Parliament were throw the Chinese out. The Chinese are the aggressors. We cannot negotiate with somebody who's occupying Indian territory. The Indian media, by and large, I would say, with one or two exceptions, supported the Parliament view. In fact, I would give you an example. I mean, I've quoted this example in the book.
Right.
That one man who was opposed to a negotiated settlement with China was Atal Bihari Vajpayee. And from 1957 to 1962, when he was a first-term MP, he criticized Krishna Menon bitterly, day in and day out in Parliament. But in 2003, the same Mr. Vajpayee went to Beijing and signed an agreement with his Chinese counterpart, which said that India will appoint a special representative, China will appoint a special representative, and these special representatives will start discussing a negotiated settlement to the border. And this has been going on from 2003. So the same Mr. Vajpayee who criticized Mr. Menon in the 50s for advocating a negotiated settlement, by 2003, when he was Prime Minister, was also supporting a negotiated settlement. So it is a tragedy that we couldn't negotiate the border. And yes, I mean, if you were to ask me, if Krishna Menon had been listened to in the 50s, our relationships with China would have been completely different. However, it's not as simple as that, because again, as I have pointed out, the flight of the Dalai Lama in 1959 raises Chinese suspicions tremendously, and that begins to cloud China's policies towards India. Also, Mao's domestic political position begins to weaken. So I'm not so sure that even if the Krishna Menon formula had been accepted in the 50s, we would not have had a war. I'm not entirely convinced about that. But certainly the border would have been resolved. And it's one of the great tragedies of Indian political history that Krishna Menon was criticized for being a Chinese stooge, whereas he wasn't. He was very pragmatic. I can tell you this: Parliament certainly tied Nehru's hands behind his back. But Nehru was a believer in Parliament. In fact, Parliament was not in session when the Chinese attacked India in October of 1962. Atal Bihari Vajpayee and N.G. Gore, a very famous socialist leader from Maharashtra, wrote a letter to Nehru, please convene Parliament. And Nehru convened Parliament. And Parliament was meeting when the Chinese were attacking India. This is what people forget. You see, the Chinese first attacked India on the 20th of October 1962. Then they stopped on the 28th of October 1962. Nehru convened Parliament on the 11th of November 1962, and the second invasion of the Chinese took place on the 16th of November 1962. Can you imagine? The Chinese are invading India when Parliament is in session. And every day, Mr. Nehru is going to Parliament and listening to Acharya Kripalani, N.G. Gore, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, and all these great leaders attacking his policy. That is what Parliament was. That was the strength of Indian democracy. But in a way, public opinion was definitely weakened Mr. Nehru's negotiating position. He was weak to begin with because, as I said, his own cabinet was divided. Govind Vallabh Pant in 1960 was against the negotiated. And Morarji Desai was against it. Swaran Singh was against it. The Vice President of India, Dr. Radhakrishnan, was against it. The President of India, Rajendra Prasad, was against it. So his hands were tied. Parliament certainly, handicapped him. But I think it's very important to recognize that he convened Parliament when the invasion was on. And that is the strength of Indian democracy. When the Prime Minister was sitting in Parliament and listening to criticisms of his China policy when the Chinese were invading India. That's not the situation today, unfortunately.
Sir, I think with this, we would like to end the session. And I would like to give a vote of thanks. And on behalf of Amity Institute of Liberal Arts, I, Dr. Kunwar Siddharth Dedwal, would like to conclude today's session by thanking. And really, it was an honor, privilege, and we are pleased to have such a deliberative session with Mr. Jairam Ramesh, sir. And thank you, sir, for sparing time for us and discussing such relevant aspects of such an eminent personality who's, as I said in the beginning also, who's very less spoken of and written of. And many young scholars should read about such eminent personalities. And it is only because of people like you that we get opportunity to revisit our Indian political history. And as a political scientist, I always believe that that is a relevant aspect of our life. And we look forward to host you someday in our university where we could also deliberate on some other contemporary topics as well. And as we always expect from our distinguished guest, and the fact that we will be definitely be reading many more books from your end. So definitely we'll have another round of interaction with you on that as well. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. And please stay in touch. You have my email address. So you can always get in touch with me by email, by WhatsApp.
Definitely.
And I wish you all the very best.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.